Hi everyone. So it's a book I've been wanting to do my review of for a while now. I finished this probably 2-3 weeks ago. Richard Dawkins, The Genetic Book of the Dead, a Darwinian Reverie. Now I'm in a park, hopefully there's not too much extra noise and people staring at me and so on. Not a lot of cars in the background, hopefully you don't pick all that up. But anyway, so this is a really fascinating book and I learned heaps out of it. It's a book which I think a book I might dip back into a few times. His basic argument is that the DNA of any organism can be read like a palimpsest. And palimpsest is this thing here where old letters, and I've seen these in John Oxley Library where you would write, I mean here in the example it's written vertically in blue, then across right angles in red. So it's new information getting written on top of old information, and his argument is that the DNA of an organism does that. And so if you look at, say, a lizard and it's got dry scaly skin, that tells us that somewhere in its background it needed to survive in an environment that had dry scaly skin. So saying the DNA can be read like a book telling you what environments that creature evolved through. And I can kind of see that in a way, but also information is lost or transformed or mutated. So I mean, look, I'm no expert on this, certainly nowhere near Dawkins's level, but it's not like we have all of the DNA still in us right from the word go. There's that William Hurt film, Altered States. There's a helicopter going around now. I hope you're not picking up all this noise. But anyway, this great film years ago, I haven't seen it for a long time, where so I'm near the hospital, that's why there's a care flight chopper. Hopefully there's no person there. Anyway, so the argument in Altered States is, sorry, I've got this card on the phone, so I just don't look at my own reflection, and it's blowing around in the wind here. Oh, there it goes. Okay, don't worry about it. So it's, let me just put this over the phone case. I still like to see myself as I do these reviews, as I concentrate on what I'm talking about. So I'll put something over the forward-facing screen. Yeah, so in Altered States, he's a scientist and he believes that we still have all of that ancient DNA in our genome, and through drugs or something, I can't remember, you can unlock it, and he basically transforms into a caveman. And that's about all I remember. I haven't seen it for decades, but it's kind of pretty funny. But yeah, so to a degree, the genome tells us about the past and the route through evolution that a particular organism has, but I don't think it captures all the information that was on that route, if that makes sense. And that's not really something that Dawkins discusses in here. But it introduced me to a whole lot of new ideas, which I guess anyone who knows a lot about genetics would already be over. The gene-centered view of evolution, or the gene's eye view of evolution, the extended phenotype. And these are all really important concepts, and it's basically that if there's evolution ultimately acts on the genetic level, not on the level of the organism. So the organism is just a container for the genes, and obviously different organisms make choices or get eaten by other organisms or whatever. Things happen on that level, but that's still driven ultimately back down on the genetic level. So I think centering it on the genes perspective is actually really important and quite valid. And there's a great diagram in here which really illustrates how well the relationship, if I can just find it here, between different genes. There's so many different genes doing different things at different times, and if you affect one, that kind of affects others. Can't find it. So he had a diagram of a sheep held up by about 20 different bits of rope or string, and they're tangled around each other, so if you cut one, it kind of affects the others to a certain degree, which I thought was a very useful analogy. But the extended phenotype, the idea there is that the genes going on the genes in an organism also affect things outside that organism. So even like a bird nest is ultimately driven by genetics, and so the genes are affecting things outside just the organism. And then there's a great example, I think it was with spotted doves, it might be a slightly different pigeon, can't remember, but he was saying that when the male starts cooing, just that sound triggers the female to start ovulating, and so there are effects in the female's body that are ultimately getting driven by the male's genes, because the cooing is ultimately comes down to the genes driving that and allowing that to happen. So that was really cool. I hadn't thought too much about this extended, I hadn't thought at all about this extended phenotype as well, and also how some traits can only come down certain lines. It's a little bit different to being sex-linked to sex-limited traits, I think he was talking about. I'd have to reread that just to fully understand it, but it's he looked at the example of cuckoos in Europe, can't remember which species, and the ones that lay eggs that match certain host species, that information can only be stored in the females, not in the males, because the males breed readily across the population, whereas the females will only specialise in certain hosts. And a great example, which I suppose I partly thought about this, but when you consider your siblings, you both have the same parents, but you don't have identical DNA, and this is all to do in the way in meiosis and when the sex cells are formed and crossing over and so on, and the way the genes get distributed. So a sperm or an ova could have more of it, so your grandparents' genes, it's not all evenly distributed. So this is why someone takes more after their mother or their father, that kind of thing. But anyway, he said something like William the Conqueror could be one of your ancestors, but you may have none of his genes in you. And so we draw these what would you call them, breeding charts, ancestral charts, whatever, where everyone has 2 and then 2 and 2 and 2, ancestors, but that's not the actual influence. You're not getting equal influence from all of them because of the way the genes kind of get split up and then shared through the different generations. So that was really interesting too. That was probably the thing I found most interesting in the whole book. So as I read a lot of these popular science books, because I'm writing one myself, I do think what makes a good popular science book, and I think it's, to me at least, it's a well-structured argument that's leading to a certain point. And Dawkins himself says some of these things are covered in some of his other books, like The Selfish Gene. So this is more like a meandering, well, not so much meandering, but just like a grab bag of different but related things. I wouldn't say that it all overall leads to one big conclusion, but some of his other books do that. So it's probably like he had a lot of leftover, slightly associated ideas he wanted to write about, and he is getting on now, very sadly. He's a great man, I'm a big fan. And I think he just wanted to just put out these ideas while he had them, but I don't think it's the same as one book that's leading to one great big take or position on something. I had a quick look a few weeks ago at some of the online reviews, and a lot of people rave about the artwork in here, and I mean, this is a particularly good page. Some of it I find is actually better than others, but I didn't actually like the artwork. I mean, that was probably not quite as good, but it's certainly heaps better than I could do. But the thing I didn't like about the artwork is, I think if you have a scientific book, you want artwork, like as good as this artwork is, but you want artwork that's kind of pretty scientific. And I mean, doing feathers is really hard. It's what people like William Cooper is so fantastic. But you want artwork that, like, I mean, it certainly illustrates it quite well, but a scientific book, I think it just adds to the gravitas if the illustrations are all fairly scientific, and like this here they are, so that would be the exception to that. There's a few like that, but you know, I would rather more kind of scientific drawings than figurative ones, even though the figurative ones are fairly good. So yeah, I wasn't actually as good as artwork is. To me, it just doesn't really suit this kind of book. Yeah, I would rather more hardcore, or like photographs, or you know, proper scientific illustrations kind of things. Well, another interesting thing, what's it here that he had was that he discussed was reptile. I never thought about this with turtles. So you have fish, amphibians coming onto land, reptiles, and then they return to the sea. The turtles, I never thought about reptiles, and then the land-based ones who come back onto land. It's pretty amazing. You know, out then back in, then back out again. Of course, we all know about mammals, the whales and sea cows and so on that went to the you know, return to the water, going back and forth with the land-based tortoises. It's interesting. This is the diagram I was thinking of. Just think of these as the genes, this is the phenotype. You cut one or move one, it kind of affects others. And it's a really good example of how all of these changes are going on inside us all the time, with different proteins being produced, and they all mesh together, they all time out perfectly. Well, I mean, mind you, there's also timing with some genes controlling other genes. You know, another interesting thing he talked about. But anyway, it just made me think about how there's all this going on at once, and yet it all sits in together really well. And it's really more like that than a perfectly staged or planned process. And it's just through the crucible of natural selection and evolution that it sits in well. Yeah, now what was I going to say? I just had a thought. I've forgotten it now. I just thought of another interesting thing that it mentioned. I think it's going to come back to me. No, I'll not come back to it. Anyway, so look, I like the information. I'm probably going to like his other books more, but still, there's really good information in here. I'm not sure what other point I was going to make. What was it about? Oh yeah, so if the environment favours a certain trait, and those genes are selected for, you get not corresponding genes just to either side of it on the chromosome that kind of go for the ride and get selected for as well, which is really cool. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, so there's a lot of good information in here. I think the perfect science book, to me, it's kind of like a balance between a textbook. It needs the structure and the purpose of a textbook, but with the easy language, and it all leads to a certain conclusion. Whereas this is more a bit of, I mean, it's all tightly related, but it's not leading to one big conclusion or statement like his other books would. And the other thing I wanted to talk about with this is what I would call the build quality of the book. And so, on one hand, you think this has a great build quality. That's a phrase I picked up from my friend who's an electronics engineer. But this book is really heavy. It looks really attractive. But look how beaten up my copy is. This is because I carry it around, you know, I've been carrying it to read places when I go on holidays or just in my backpack or something, and then that's starting to split off there. The pages are very heavy. It's great having colour illustrations in there and colour photographs as well. But the pages are thick, the book is heavy, it gets barely beaten up. You know, maybe it's just, and now look, the embossing's coming off there, or the printing, or whatever, something stuck on it. This has really been knocked around because in order to read a lot, I just take books with me. And so this sadly has copped a lot of treatment in my backpack and various places. So I wish there was a paperback. I was keen to read this right away, so I bought it as a hardback. I checked, there was no paperback available. So I just think the book should come out as a paperback as well. First off, I know they do hardbacks and then paperbacks, but seriously, who reads them like this? Probably some people do, I don't know, but man, that's heavy. And I'll tell you, if I don't know if it's possible or not, but if you could crack the code where, I don't have a paperback with me, there's one in the car, but just a normal paperback, if you could crack the code where you had that kind of paper with colour printing on it, that would just be the ideal. So you wouldn't have to have a section of photos, you could just print them in amongst the text. So there are some photos in here. So I mean, it's good quality paper, so you can have colour printing and colour illustrations and colour photos. But it just makes for an unworkable unit for me anyway. Probably for others who like to keep this on a desk and read it at home or in bed, fine. But for anyone who's moving a bit more or got a lot on, paperback's much better. So I think I've reviewed one other hardback. The Runner book was hardback, but it was smaller and not as heavy. Probably a different kind of paper, I'm not sure, but anyway, I'm just really focusing on the paperbacks now, just for practical reasons. But that was it. I really enjoyed that book. It's really worth the read. It opened up a lot of new concepts to me, and there's a lot of further reading that I like to do, but now it's giving me an idea of these concepts which I didn't have before. So there we go. If there's any chance you read this, see this review, Richard, I hope you liked it, and thanks for all your great work. Okay, thanks guys, see ya.